Before I start this book review, I do want to place several trigger warnings for this novel, as this is a very heavy novel and deals with a lot of very troubling things that I think a lot of people need to be aware of before they dive into this novel or before I talk about it in this review. Those trigger warnings include attempted suicide, depression, anxiety, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, sexual assault, eating disorders, and racism. There are honestly countless more, but a lot of them are related to the same things. But just know going into this novel that it's very, very heavy. It's very hard to get through, but is otherwise a very good novel in the sense of how it deals with these different topics that are involved and different triggers that are involved, as the author herself has either been experienced with those things or has talked with many a person who has shared their experience that she has written down into this story. Hey, what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I am going to do a book review for the book Perfect by Ellen Hopkins. I read this for my 24-hour readathon after I had finished Justice Buried, as you guys may have seen if you've watched my 24-hour readathon video, and I talked quite a bit about this in that video, but I did want to talk more about it in depth in this review. There's a lot going on in this novel, as it is a companion novel to one of Ellen Hopkins' other books called Impulse. Now, I read Impulse a few summers ago, which you guys can go check out the review for that linked up above and down in the description. The story of Impulse followed three teenagers who were all placed in this mental rehabilitation program due to several different kinds of events, whether it is bulimia, anorexia, suicide, something along those lines essentially. There are four storylines that go into Perfect. One of them is the twin sister of one of the boys who was in Impulse, Connor. One of the storylines follows his sister Kara right after he has tried to commit suicide and is sent off to the mental rehabilitation center. Essentially, this story follows the same timeline as Impulse does, so you could read both of these at the same time and really get an idea for kind of what was happening as Connor was at the rehabilitation center and what was happening to Kara essentially at the same time. Now, this does have three other storylines, but I do want to kind of go into them separately, as each one deals with some very different kinds of things, and each one is related to the next, as this story essentially includes four people who all somehow know each other in this story. So the first storyline is Kara's, and she is essentially dealing with the aftermath of witnessing her brother try to commit suicide and dealing with the familial problems that are going on with her parents after this, and trying to also deal with some sexuality issues that she develops as the story goes on that really hurts her relationship with her boyfriend Sean, who also in this story is essentially addicted to steroids. He is really trying to become the best baseball player in the world, but is incredibly in love with Kara and wants to do everything he can for her, but essentially succumbs to his steroids and actually does a lot of damage to not only his relationship but to himself. Then there's a storyline following the girl Kendra, who actually was Connor's ex-girlfriend, who he dumped right before having gone into the mental rehabilitation center, and you learn a lot about what exactly happened to Connor preluding up to his attempted suicide in this novel, and Kendra really is dealing with that aftermath as well, thinking she wasn't good enough for him and she wasn't good enough to make him stay. In order to really kind of get back at him and make herself to be a better model, she develops an eating disorder, anorexia specifically, where she stops eating and tries to make herself thinner in order to make herself look better, and even decides to go into plastic surgery to help with getting her more gigs. Then there's a storyline following Kendra's little sister's boyfriend named Andre, who is a wonderful dancer. He loves to dance, wants to go to school for dance, but unfortunately lives in a household where his parents absolutely despise the idea. They want him to do something much more practical, much more like what they're doing, something that's much more respectable. Unfortunately, Andre also has to go some very racist remarks, as he is African American, and especially with dating Kendra's little sister, their parents don't really necessarily like the idea that she is dating a black boy. Essentially, this book is really dealing with ideas of perfection and how everyone's idea of perfection is different, and how unfortunately we as young adults and teenagers will succumb to these ideas of perfection in order to make ourselves be known and make ourselves be seen as good in the eyes of adults, whether it's our parents or whether it's employers or anyone really in society that we think has an influence in our lives if we do things in the way that they want them to. Every book that Ellen Hopkins writes is in a prose poetry form, meaning that the poems themselves look more like a piece of fiction than they do an actual poem, which is very common for her to write. Every book that I have read by her, the Crank series, Tilt, Impulse, Identical, as well as Perfect, have all been in this format. I believe that this makes the novel so much easier to read, because if this was in an actual pure poetry form, such as a sonnet of some kind, the story would be a lot harder, I think, to understand. And so I really enjoy the fact that Ellen really brings in prose poetry and shows a lot of people that you can write poetry in a different kind of way and be freeform with it and have a lot of fun with it, while also conveying a story within several different poems in one book. Now, this isn't to say that this is a poetry collection. This is actually a novel, but it is written in a prose form in order to kind of tell the story in a different way. This also makes it a lot easier when transitioning between different viewpoints, as each poem that the character will end on helps to transition us to the next character, as it is either a word or a phrase that ends the previous poem that goes into the next poem, starting it out and essentially going along the same train of thought as the previous poem. It's really hard to explain without actually showing you what it's like, and so I'm going to quickly show you an example of this kind of phenomenon that Ellen Hopkins does in order to make sense. So for instance, on page 24 and 25 of Perfect, there is a poem on the left side by Kendra and the poem on the left side, which is starting off with Sean. Now, the one with Kendra has a line that says, "Fight for Buff." That first word, Buff, is then used as the title for the next poem, which is from Sean's point of view. This is very common for Ellen Hopkins. She writes this way to make it a little easier of a transition between these characters, and I think is much more effective than leaving the poem as is without having any kind of transition and giving it some kind of other title. I do want to stress, though, that again, this is a very, very heavy novel. It's very hard sometimes to get through these. I did read this all in one day, but I had to take several breaks throughout it because there was a lot that was going on that I felt not exactly uncomfortable with, but just kind of weighed heavy on my heart, because I know what it's like to want to try to live up to somebody's expectations and be perfect in somebody's eyes. I feel that every person that's alive on this earth has gone through that at some point, or will be going through that at some point. And so it's really hard to read about characters that are going through this exact same thing, in the sense that they're trying to live up to perfection, maybe not in the same situation, but the idea of trying to live up to perfection. And it's very heartbreaking, and especially with a lot of these characters, seeing them go down the path that they go on is very hard for you to read, because it almost makes you feel like you are actually them, or you're actually witnessing them go through this path, when they're fictional characters. They're not real, they're not based on anyone, they're just characters that you're reading, but it breaks your heart to see them have to go through this treacherous path, this very dangerous path that they are on in some cases. So again, if you are triggered by anything that I had mentioned earlier, I do advise you to stay away from this kind of novel, and pretty much stay away from any of Ellen Hopkins' writing, because a lot of her writing focuses on many of these same topics. But if you are not exactly triggered, or you feel that you are able to handle yourself in the situation where you are to read this, I do highly recommend Ellen Hopkins as a writer, because I do think that although she writes very heavy topics, she does it in a way that is more sensitive compared to how a lot of other people would write these kinds of topics. She doesn't stereotype anyone, she doesn't really generalize any ideas, she makes every single case individual that it comes across, and she actually, in the beginning of the novel, thanks a lot of people who gave her their experiences and told her their stories of different things about trying to live up to certain expectations that inspired her to write about different characters that also were going through these same things. So it's obvious that this is a novel that is well researched, for one, and is well sensitively read throughout, that makes it so that we're able to read this and understand that this is not supposed to be a poke at certain people. It's more or less really a book that is trying to highlight these problems that are in society and what it is leading to in our young people today. But there you guys go. That's my very lengthy, kind of rambly talk about Perfect by Ellen Hopkins. Again, I do highly recommend this novel if you are willing to read it, if you are able to read it, but I do want to advise strongly for those of you who are very easily triggered to stay away from this, as it was very hard for me, as someone who doesn't exactly match up with any of these trigger warnings, to read through. It was just very hard and very heavy, but also really kind of eye-opening and thought-awakening in terms of understanding just how bad this stuff can really be for a lot of people. But it is a very good novel. I obviously gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Every Ellen Hopkins book I've read so far has been so fantastic in the way that the topics are delivered and the way that it is handled and the way that the stories are lining up and the way that she just writes is just so wonderful. But there you guys go. Those are my thoughts. And if you guys did read this novel yourselves and would like to discuss it in the comments below, or if you've read any of other Ellen Hopkins' writing that you think I would enjoy, please leave them down in the comments below. Also, do give this video a big thumbs up. And if you haven't already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.